Hi, it's Lili. Today I'm going to show you how I made this sculpture out of a sheet of copper from scratch and step by step. Enjoy! So to create this sculpture, I've used a big sheet of copper, 2 feet by 4 feet, which is roughly 61 centimeters by 122 centimeter. In terms of thickness, I've used a 16 gauge, which is 1.5 millimeter thick. Now to show you why I need so much length, I use a piece of aluminium wire, roughly the same size than my sheets, so a bit more than 1.20 m, and round it up. And you can see very quickly that once you twist it, turn it, shape it, in order to work on a big scale, you need to have quite some length to work with. So I took a Sharpie and I started to create my line. I didn't want to have something too regular, too controlled, so I randomly created my lines, and I like the fact that some pieces were wider than others. So I had some wide ones, some thin ones. It was a good combination. So I set up my copper on my bench and dress up for the occasion. It's important to dress to impress when you work with metal. So I always have my rubber gloves anyway when I work with metal to protect my hands, but I double up the gloves and have another layer in leather because it's about to get really hot in there. I also make sure I have a proper respirator with some filters and some sexy goggles, especially for plasma cutter. I happen to have a jacket that is flame resistant, otherwise ideally cotton to do some welding. In terms of shoes, make sure you have steel toe cap. Mine are chainsaw boots, so it's probably more than necessary, but I can guarantee no metal is going to go through that. So just make sure you have some safe boots. Now to cut the metal, I use a plasma cutter. The one I've used so far is a Cutmaster 40, which works absolutely great. You usually need to have them connected to an air compressor. Those are beasts, as you can see it. They're usually not cheap and they're quite noisy. And until that point, I didn't realize that there's an alternative that exists. So now my teacher showed me this one, which is a Parkside plasma cutter PPSkey 40B2. I'm not sponsored by them, but it was honestly the first time that I hear that you can have a plasma cutter and compressor combined. And I thought it was worth a shot. So we set it up, decided to do some experiment with it. It didn't feel as strong and sturdy as a normal plasma cutter connected with a big compressor, but it did the job. It took a bit of time to get used to it. It was a bit flimsy sometimes. It didn't start when I pressed the button, so it was not as straightforward, but it's relatively cheap. I think it's 240 pounds. And at the end of the day, it did the job. So that's worth mentioning. It got some little wheels on it, which are supposed to be helpful and to make sure it's straight. And I did a few runs with it, and after a while, I was like, nah, got rid of it. I'd rather go freehand to do the plasma cutting. Usually when I work with metal, I have some sanding discs which are 40 grit, but because copper is so soft, I shift that to an 80 grit disc, and that did the job absolutely fine. I mean, you can use flap disc as well, especially for the edge, because flap disc are a bit more rounded. That would be a good alternative. So if you use a plasma cutter and it's a bit of a mess, it doesn't matter because you can really soften everything up with the grinder. Now I went around all the edges flat first to make sure they were smooth. Once I was happy with that, then I position my grinder at an angle because I need to deburr it above and underneath to make sure it was nicer and smooth. When it comes to the texture, I did a bit of experiment. You have the classic wire brush, which works well. I've used it on other projects, but there's something I recently discovered is a blender, and it's quite cool because it gives an interesting texture to it. It's best to do some tests on some leftover pieces first before applying it to just about everything. So these are the Norton Vortex Rapid Blender, and they are actually really great. Good to smooth it up, good to do plenty of things. They are not cheap, and I use quite a few of them, but I really like the texture that it creates. So it really depends on your taste. Some like it completely smooth and polished and shiny. I like to have something a bit different, and I like to do experiments. So as you can see here, it gives me something a bit more dynamic in terms of texture. Once I have all my 10 pieces done, I went around the anvil and carefully pressed it bits by bits with my hands. And as you can see, slowly but surely you curve it up. Considering I'm working with a 16 gauge. It is soft enough to shape it, but at the same time it's got some meat to it and some resistance. So I think it's just a good balance, and overall I really enjoyed the kind of shape I was able to have. If you're working in a big metal workshop, you might have access to those big machine and rollers, and those are great for the larger piece. Once it gets wider, it's a bit tougher, so I think it was helpful for some of the wider piece to have some proper curve out of it. Then I set up all my pieces on my table and start to figure out how on earth am I gonna do this sculpture. And I figure it's better to have them as tangled as possible because it gives me more points of contact to create my weld. As you can see, I had some pieces really tight, some that are wider. I start to position it in different direction as well. And then I shipped the whole thing onto a metal table, which I should have done to begin with because I was about to do some welding and it's best to be on the metal table to do so. So I tried to get them as tight as possible, as tangled as possible. At that time, I only had a round rod, which is my steel 5mm thick, and I thought that will do. Oh boy, I was naive. That's clearly not strong enough, but at that time, I didn't know that. In terms of the rod, I used the copper phosphorus soldier Super 6 to do all my welds. The machine I used to do it is a big old TIG machine, SIP T214. Now use whatever TIG machine you have available. Obviously you need a good machine, but more importantly you need to have an altar torch. As you can see it in my hand, it looks small, isn't it? That was the only way to get in there, inside of the sculpture. Because if I take a more classic torch for TIG, you can see they look quite long. You have different versions of the back cap, some are shorter than others, but in that case I had to really reduce it to the minimum and to alter the torch so that is as small as possible just to get in there. So obviously the torch head is smaller, and the tungsten inside of this head are going to be smaller as well, because that's the only way they're going to ever fit. So then I set up everything in place and I start my weld. And the first few welds on the outside was easy peasy, I will say. Easy to get in there and to access. Once I start to move around, it starts to become more and more clear that it's going to be complicated. Get the torch in there, get the wire, be able to see what I'm doing. It started to become obvious that I made my life very complicated with this sculpture. And then once I had as many welding points as I could from that angle, I very carefully turned the sculpture on its side. And at that time, I realized just the sheer weight of the beast and the fact that my central run bar wasn't enough to hold it, and I had some flex to it. So I start to realize, okay, I have a little problem here. But at that time, I was just trying to get some new welding points here and there to reinforce the whole sculpture. So I've done this quite a few times, welding as many points as possible, turn it around, welding, turn it around. Once I had numerous amount of welding point and I feel more strength, I had to address the central bar, which clearly isn't going to be up for the job. So I had to remove it, get rid of my weld. My initial idea was to use the cutting disc for the Dremel, but because it's so difficult to get in there and the space is limited inside the sculpture, I had to shift to actually use some burr. I have some tungsten burr that are quite aggressive. This bit did the job really nicely. Once you start using the Dremel and you have those small particles flying everywhere, make sure you have a respirator with the filter, some eye protection and some ear protection as well. So I had to get rid of those welds, and they were quite thick because I really tried to build it up around the central bar to add some strength. So I had a lot to get rid of. So I was able to remove my central round bar, which was 5mm, and replace it with 3 bars. Each of them were 8mm. And I was trying to get in there from different points, so I had multiple new welding points that will add some strength, and they will all meet at the top like a pyramid kind of thing, which I think was a good strategy in terms of strength. Then I was able to go back to do some more TIG and weld the whole piece together with those new 3 central round bars. I've also decided to use some stainless rods to do the weld inside to make sure they were even stronger. that turned out to be a good decision. Gravity played a big part in welding, so I've moved and shifted the sculpture around to make sure I have better access to some specific points, such as the top of the sculpture. Another position that was really important is standing up, the way the actual final sculpture is going to be, so I can see properly how it looks and get more access in there from different points. I'm still a newbie with welding, so my welds are a bit of a mess and need lots of fixing. So in order to do that, I've went back to my big blender to begin with, clean it up from the outside. Then for the smaller part, I use some abrasive wheels with my Dremel just to see how much I need to fix. Then I use the more abrasive burr, really get in there and soften all my welds. And then I use the sanding drum wheels with 120 grit rolls, and that'll help really soften it up. And then I use more abrasive wheels to finish it up. So overall, my best combination was this large blending wheels, then some smaller abrasive wheels, then my tungsten burr, much more aggressive to fix the weld, then the 120 grits drum wheels, and finally more of those abrasive wheels in different grits. I found those on Amazon. They're quite cheap, for like £10 for 40 pieces. Those are really great and efficient, especially to get in there in hard to reach areas, but they wear off quite quickly, so I end up using loads of them, probably 60 or even 80 pieces for the whole complete sculpture by the end of it. I had lots of cleanup to do, that's for sure. It took me quite some time. And I noticed that one of my bar was completely off, probably because I spent way too much time on one specific welding point that was building up and, let's be honest, making a mess out of it. And the heat allow the bars with gravity to bend down. So I wasn't happy with that. I used a torch with some propane and oxygen and asked my teacher Natalie, the official iron lady, to help me out to make sure we isolate and only torch exactly that specific point. Then I was holding the bar on one side with my right hand, as you can see, and wait until the specific point against the torch was turning red, so the metal will be at the right temperature so I can very easily bend it upwards. And that helps while we were shielding the rest of the copper to try to not melt everything else. Once the metal turned red, then it was very easy to bend the metal upwards, and that gave me an extra anchor point to weld it against the copper at the base, and that really helped for the strength. Once the welding point was done, then I isolate and protected the copper and brought the torch back against this specific point. So once again, try to protect the copper, wait until the specific part of the round bar turn red, and then very gently you go back into the exact position you want. And I've done this on the 3 bars. Once I was happy with this, I reused the previous round bar 5mm and cut it to size, and then I welded in position. That gave me strength. I connected the 3 bar, created a little triangle there, took it in place. That gave me more strength. When that level was done, I replicated the same system much lower. That helped stabilize those bar, add more strength once again, and later on it turned out really helpful when I was trying to get it into the ground, because I can literally put my feet onto this level of bars and helping lower it down the ground. I've also used a grounder to make sure the bottom were sharp and on an edge so that it will get into the soil much easier. Now I had lots of cleanup left to do, and the only way to reach the inside of the sculpture was to use the flexible shaft from Dremel, which is much smaller. It was literally the only way to get in there. So I used that. I used lots of those abrasive wheels that I mentioned earlier, the one I had from Amazon, just to get in there from every direction, move it around. But even if those abrasive wheels were great, they were not able to reach everywhere. So I had to cut a piece of Scotch-Brite into really tiny pieces and try to get in there with my fingers, and boy, that was tricky. It was just so hard to reach. It was a struggle. I was losing my little bits of Scotch-Brite, had to dig it back up, put it back in, try to reach and not try to lose my sanity while doing it. So that was fun. At some point I realized the texture that I've applied on the outside, which I thought looks great, I was not able to replicate the same texture everywhere, and it didn't really look cohesive with the rest of it, so I wasn't too happy with that, and I thought there's one way very easy to fix it up. Is actually take the scarf right and carefully go over just about every bit to make it look more cohesive and to make sure the texture looks nice and even. It was important to move the sculpture around to make sure I can have access and see from every point, and especially having it standing up, because that's the final position, so I need to make sure that is perfect. Then I have to seal it. For that I use this crystal clear protective coat from Rust-Oleum, and I use the whole can. I apply 2 coats. I don't have a spraying booth, so I use a leftover piece of Corex and just spray against it to limit the amount of particles flying in the air. I apply the first coat, leave it to dry for an hour, and then apply the second coat. And there you have it, my sculpture is finished. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've got other projects with copper coming up, and until then, take good care of yourself. Bye bye.